Okay, welcome to Chapter 16. We're going to be looking at the writing requirement and some electronic records for business law. I like this chapter. One of the reasons I like this chapter is I'm going to get a chance to talk a little bit about history. And as a frustrated historian, there's nothing better than having a captive audience. In this case, students who have to listen to you drone on about minor stuff because you find it's interesting. So let's jump in. And let's start talking about the writing requirement. The basic start of this story, of course, is literacy. If you went back to when the common law begins to develop, and remember, common law is the basis of pretty much all English law in one shape or form. It's been modified and changed, and there are statutes, administrative law, but at its heart, the common law begins it all. And the common law really starts in the early Middle Ages. Some people call Henry II, for example, the father of the common law. And that'd be right around 1100 AD or so, to give you a nice convenient number. Well, what was life like in England in 1100? Well, almost everybody, 99% of the population, is engaged in agriculture. You need that much of the population to grow the food to feed the rest. There's not a lot of mechanization. So you've got 90+% of the people working on the farms. Even the ones that aren't directly working on the farms, they might be shipping goods or relying upon agriculture. It's a very small percentage that might be doing industry, and an even smaller percentage that we would say would be doing informational work. So philosophers, thinkers, things like that. As a consequence of this, there's not a lot of literacy. Most people, until starting around, I'd say about 1500 or so, most people in England can't read or write. So there's really very little point of saying, well, we want contracts in writing. First of all, because people can't read, they can't write, and books are hideously expensive. It would be an entire year's wages, or close to it in some parts of this period, to purchase a book, much less to fill out contracts. So this starts to change. We have this illiterate society with a smattering of people that can read and write, primarily priests, a few people that work for the government, a few nobles, but that's pretty rare. A few people are in universities in the Middle Ages, but again, a shockingly small percentage. This starts to change right around the Reformation. First of all, there is an explosion in books. You have more and more people getting access to the written word, and you have an explosion in teaching people to read and write. So we're not positive, but we're pretty sure that the first society on the planet where both men and women, in the majority, could read and write is actually here in America, is in New England. Because during the Protestant Reformation in England, the different Protestant sects put a great deal of emphasis on the ability of a person to have this direct personal relationship with God. And this was learned and expressed in the Bible. So you didn't want the priest as this intermediary anymore between God and man. That meant that people had to be able to read the Bible themselves. So if you go to New England in the 1650s, let's say, there are schools. Everybody's being taught to read and write, including the girls. So by the 1600s, more and more of the population can read and write, and people began to trust the written word more. Because if you think about it, if you say, well, what do you remember of what happened 20 years ago about where landlines are? Or what do you remember about our contract that we signed 2 years ago? You could have different memories. But if you've got something written down, if you've got something in writing that each side can read and refer to and potentially has a copy of, then you can enforce them more easily. Now, as England goes through this Protestant Reformation and emerges at the other end, we have in 1677 the passage of what's called the Statute of Frauds. This is a requirement that certain contracts, to be enforceable, must be in writing. All states in the United States today have similar statutes requiring that certain contracts be reduced to writing. even if it's electronic writing today. The key here is we're looking for something that is written and, the real important point, signed by the party against whom you're trying to enforce it. So you can have a written contract, but if the guy you're suing never signed it, it doesn't meet statute of fraud. It's not a contract. So we want a written contract signed by the guy that you are suing. So here are the 5, and we're going to stick with the last number in a second. I'll explain that. But here are the 5 basic types of contract that we require to be in writing under classic statute of frauds. Contracts involving land. The easiest example there is the buying and selling of it. Contracts you can't perform in less than a year. So these are long-term contracts. Contracts that are collateral or secondary promises, where you're answering for the debt of another. Contracts in consideration of marriage. Now this is not a proposal, but we'll explain it. And then contracts for the sale of goods valued over $500. Now I'm going to keep that number, and that's the number we're going to use for this class. Different states have different numbers. This number has gone up. Obviously, we live in an inflationary cycle, so this number is going to change. But we want to say, well, below a certain point, a pack of gum, that doesn't have to be in writing. A car, yeah, we want that in writing. So let's break them down and start talking about them. Let's talk about land. Now, if you think of land, as I said, the example here is the buying and selling of land. So certainly the transfer of land permanently, the issuing of a deed or contract for sale, we want that in writing. But it also is going to include possessory interest, so that if you have a rental situation, we want that to be in writing. So if you have anything to do with land, buying, selling the land, encumbering the land, we want that to be in writing because it's important. In fact, it's one of the few areas where we're going to require you to file written copies of your communication with the other side. So if you sell a piece of property and you issue a deed, that deed goes to the North Carolina Register of Deeds of the county within which you are located, and a copy of that is going to be held out for public inspection. Same as if you signed a restriction on the land, like an easement. All right, the second one is what's called the 1-year rule. Any contract that cannot possibly be completed in a year or less has to be in writing. So what do we mean by this? Let's suppose that I own 400 stores, and I hire you as an efficiency expert to go around to all my stores, spending a minimum of 1 day in each store, and then give me a report at the end about how I can increase efficiency. Now you'll notice there that since there's 365 days in a year, or 366 if we're dealing with a leap year, it's impossible for you to have completed that in less than a year. If the contract might be possible, but it's unlikely to be completed in a year, we can escape this. But pretty much long-term contracts, if you think of it this way, contracts that are going to go on for a substantial length of time, we want them in writing. Why? Because you're binding someone for future behavior. Now, the collateral promise. This still exists. We still see this. It was probably more common in the past. One of the things that happened quite a bit in the 17th and particularly the 1800s was people would sign as collateral for promises. So someone would take out a loan, and he'd go to his best friend and he would say, hey, would you co-sign on this loan? I know you're not getting the land, but it gives the seller more security that the money's going to get paid. So you agree to answer for the debts of another. Those types of promises we want in writing. And again, that kind of makes sense. So today, I guess you probably see it in something like, I have a son, and if my son was buying something and it was fairly expensive and he had to make installment payments on it, the other party might say, well, Ben, you're a great kid and all that. Kid, he's 26. You're a great kid and all that, but we want your dad to sign also on the contract so that if you don't pay, we can get the money from your dad. Obviously, since they're asking me to sign, what I'm trying to intimate there is that it's got to be for the purposes, it's got to be written. Now, there is the main purpose rule. If the contract was entered to for the purposes of benefiting everybody involved, you may be able to get out of this. We may be able to get by without a written contract. So an example there would be if you bring in a third party to finance a sale, but the third party is going to get money for it. So you come to me and say, I need your help buying this. They want you to be a collateral on it. And I say, okay, I will lend you the money even. You can buy it. And I will sign, but I'm going to charge you interest. In that case, you may be able to avoid this. But again, typically those are in writing as well. Promises made in consideration of marriage. Now, what are we talking about here? Well, attorneys can get involved in marriages, obviously. There's really a couple stages we can get involved. We can get involved in prenuptial agreements, and we can get involved in antenuptial agreements before the marriage and after the marriage. Prenups are pretty common anymore. At one time they were very rare, but I think they were common, then rare, then common again. It's something society is dealing with. Any contract made about the marriage after it's already in force, like a settlement of property between the parties, okay, has got to be in writing. Anything that sets up contractual property arrangements before the marriage that carries through to the marriage has to be in writing. So if you have two parties marrying, and very often nowadays they could have substantial assets, they may not want to commingle them. The result is you could have a prenuptial agreement. The final one, and the one that's arguably the most important for us, is contracts for the sale of goods over $500. Now, as I said, that number is going to change, but we're going to, for the purposes of the court, of course, keep it at $500. If you are selling a pad of paper for $1, doesn't have to be in writing. If you're selling a car for $10,000, there has to be a written contract. Now, it doesn't have to be exceedingly detailed, but it should tell you basically what and how much is being sold. The UCC can provide all sorts of things if they're admitted. If it's kind of incomplete, it can provide even price, the quality, the time of delivery, all those things, which we'll talk about. But the contract for the sale of goods is probably the most commonly written contract because, and this is business law, I mean, it is the function of our society. Capitalism, which is at the core of our economic system, really requires this. And we like that it's written because it makes it easier to enforce. It keeps everybody notified of where they are. Okay, here are some exceptions to the statute of frauds. So you may have had a requirement that one or more that you're falling into, one or more of these are contracts, but for some reason we're going to say that no, we're going to give you a pass. So one could be partial performance. Now, if you started performance under an oral contract, then you may not be able to back out and claim statute of frauds as your defense. So you offer to sell me your car for $2,000. I give you the car, I sign over the title, I hand it to you, and you say, well, I don't want to do this. I've already partially performed, and now you're trying to back out of the contract. That's probably not going to work. Very rarely the courts will order the remedy of specific performance, which is ordering someone to complete the contract. What's more likely is by backing out, you'll be sued for breach of contract and have to pay damages. So specific performance is when you're ordered to do some act, like live up to the terms of the contract. That's pretty rare as a remedy because we don't like to turn people into slaves. We find that slaves don't really function very well under the law. Sometimes you can admit in court or in writing that there was a contract, and part of this admission or part of the writing can be taken and viewed as a contract. It's more an acknowledgement of what exists as opposed to explanation. Now, if you say, yeah, there's a contract, but he said it was for $10,000 and I said it for $2,000, that's not an admission. Promissory estoppel we already discussed in previous chapters. The UCC also allows some exceptions. Two big ones is if two merchants deal with each other. Now, a merchant under the UCC is someone who deals in goods of a kind. If I deal in goods of a kind, those types of contract can be oral. And probably, to me, one of the most interesting examples I ever stumbled across is the buying and selling of diamonds. Literally, almost all the buying and selling of wholesale diamonds. And there are different centers. There's a center of this in Amsterdam. There's a center of this in New York. It tends to be controlled by Hasidic Jews. Almost all of that is oral. Now, you go into a jewelry store and you buy an expensive ring, there's going to be a piece of paper. But people can transfer millions of dollars worth of jewels yearly, and none of it can be in writing because they're both merchants. They're both wholesalers for diamonds. Also, customized or uniquely made goods. So you go in and you say, I want a custom-made suit. They take your measurements. They measure your waist, your chest, your arms, everything. They measure everything. And they go and they make a suit. And let's suppose the suit is, a $2,000 suit. And you come back and say, nah, change my mind, don't want it. We don't have a contract. Good luck with the suit. No, since it was custom made for you, you might be denied the ability to escape based on statute of fraud. All right, so what has to exist? We've been kind of nattering around the edges here. What is enough writing? Well, as I said, fundamentally, we want some acknowledgement, some signature of the party against whom we are enforcing it. So if we have a blank piece of paper and I say this is the contract, but he didn't sign it, I'm not going to be able to enforce it against him. Now, we're just really, really used to signing contracts at the bottom on the last page. You don't have to do it. You could put the signature line on the first page. You could put it on the corner. You could put it in a triangle on page 6. Put it wherever you want. You must have some legal marking. It could only be initials. Wouldn't have to be the complete signature. You might omit a middle name. That's fine. What has to be in the contract? Well, the big thing we're looking for is how much is being sold. If I have a contract with you for barrels of oil, I can find almost anything else thanks to the UCC. But the issue is going to be how many barrels of oil? 1,000? 10,000? 100,000 barrels? How much are we talking about? We've got to identify the goods. Am I selling you what kind of oil? Again, now, this doesn't have to be a single page. It could be, well, we communicated with emails about the oil coming out of your East Texas field. And then in a letter I wrote, I said that I wanted 10,000 barrels. And taking those two things together and with a signature on them, that might be enough. That might be enough to give you the essentials of contract. Now we're going to introduce one of the rules. Let's suppose that everybody gets involved and we have what most people think of as a contract, a series of pages. It says on the front page, contract. And it's got clause 1, clause 2, clause 3, and at the end of it's got a signature. Typically at this point, when each party signs, this completed contract is called an integrated contract or a complete contract. And the parole evidence rule starts to apply. It says that this contract is the final written expression of what we agreed to. You can't go back and say, well, no, this contract's not what I want to enforce. I want to enforce what we talked about earlier. Well, this is the contract you signed. This is writing. And this is where writing, of course, becomes kind of a two-edged sword. You might have had an understanding about one thing, but the contract might say something different. Generally, the contract will prevail here. There can be exceptions to this. If after we sign the contract, I said, oh, where I said I wanted 10,000 barrels of oil, I need 12,000. You say, okay, sure. But we don't produce a written piece of paper. That could become part of the new contract, even if it's an oral part. If the contract has ambiguous terms, and we'll deal with some of those issues. If the contract is complete. If, and we'll look at a later chapter, if there are prior dealings, course of performance, or usage of trade. Those can all affect contracts, and we can admit evidence. If the contract was subject to an orally agreed upon condition, if I said to you, all right, I'm going to sign an order for 10,000 barrels of oil, but it's only going to become effective when my refinery's up and running. And I don't put that in the contract, but you know it and I know it. I mean, what do I need with the oil if I don't have a refinery? Also, we can allow the admission of evidence of our negotiation if there's an obvious or gross clerical error about the amount or price. So integrated contracts, once it's established, okay, integrated contract is established, excluding other evidence coming in. Okay, quick international law. The covenant on contracts for international sale of goods. Remember, we're really changing from the English-speaking world to everybody else, because only the English-speaking world pretty much practices the common law system, and pretty much only the English-speaking world has the statute of frauds. And even having said that, here's a bigger surprise. England pretty much doesn't have it anymore. Only America is the center. Now, America is the major economic force, has a big impact. The Convention on Contracts for the International Sale of Goods, called the CISG, states that contracts for sales need not be concluded in or evidenced by writing and is not subject to any other requirements of form. Basically, this has omitted the requirement of the statute of frauds. Today, most countries don't require things to be in writing. Even England has repealed most of the statute of frauds. It's still very strong in America, but gone in most of the rest of the world. Okay, relatively short chapter. We'll be moving on. I will talk to you a little later.